Stop trying. Effort is the very thing blocking your desire. The law does not respond to force, it responds to being. Enter the state and watch the 3D chase you. There comes a moment in every seeker's journey when effort itself becomes the burden. Not because desire is wrong, but because the constant trying, fixing and forcing quietly confirms the very thing one is attempting to escape, the feeling of not having. Most people believe they must chase life, persuade reality, or wrestle circumstances into submission, yet this belief is precisely what keeps fulfillment perpetually out of reach. The mind strains, the body tightens, and the heart grows restless, all in the name of making it happen, and still nothing truly changes. This is the subtle tragedy of effort. It exhausts you while affirming lack. What if the problem has never been that you are doing too little, but that you are doing too much? What if the reason things seem to arrive only when you stop caring is not coincidence, but law? There is a deeper intelligence at work beneath conscious striving, a dimension of being that does not respond to pressure but to acceptance, not to anxiety, but to quiet knowing. Neville Goddard spoke of this as the art of receiving, the shift from labor to allowance, from trying to flow. Flow is not passivity, and it is certainly not indifference to life. It is the natural movement that occurs when resistance ends and the mind returns to its rightful place of rest. Most people live convinced that the outer world is solid, demanding, and authoritative, while the inner world is fragile and secondary. They attempt to change appearances by wrestling appearances, unaware that the visible world is only an echo, faithfully reflecting the state from which they are seeing it. When you chase the 3D world, you declare it to be cause. When you relax into the assumption of being, you quietly restore yourself to your true position as origin. And in that reversal, something extraordinary happens. The world begins to chase you. Opportunities appear without effort, solutions organize themselves, and events line up with a precision that feels almost uncanny yet deeply familiar. The exhaustion many feel is not from life itself, but from living against the current of this law. Trying to manifest while inwardly tense is like gripping a seed in your fist and demanding it grow. The tighter the grasp, the less room there is for life to unfold. Flow begins the moment you understand that fulfillment does not respond to force, but to consent. You do not command reality into obedience, you assume a state, and reality rearranges itself to mirror that assumption. This is not philosophy meant to inspire you for a moment. It is a practical truth meant to liberate you permanently. As we move into this understanding, something in you will recognize it, not as new information but as remembered wisdom. You will notice a softening, a quiet confidence that does not argue or prove, but simply knows. That knowing is the doorway. It is the point where effort dissolves, where receiving becomes natural, and where the endless chase finally ends. Not because you gave up, but because you arrived. There is a point at which desire completes its work, not when the outer world changes, but when the inner struggle ends. Neville called this point the Sabbath, and it has nothing to do with time, ritual, or a day on the calendar. It is a state of consciousness that arrives naturally after the mind has accepted an idea as true. The Sabbath is entered when the wish is no longer being pushed, questioned, or anxiously monitored, because the mind has already consented to its reality. Rest does not come because something has happened outside. It comes because something has been settled within. The 6 days of work that precede this rest are not physical actions, but psychological adjustments. They are the subtle inner movements where identity shifts, resistance loosens, and the feeling of I am not quietly gives way to I am. When this inner work is complete, effort becomes impossible, not because of discipline, but because desire has exhausted itself. One cannot continue to long for what one feels to be already possessed. In that moment, striving would feel unnatural, even absurd, like searching for something that is already in your hand. This is why anxiety fades when the Sabbath is entered. Concern is always a signal that the mind is still divided, still watching the world for signs, still waiting for permission to rest. But signs do not precede fulfillment. They follow it. The Sabbath is the deep knowing that nothing needs to be checked, measured, or confirmed. The inner verdict has already been rendered. When consciousness accepts itself as the thing desired, it naturally withdraws its restless attention from appearances and settles into stillness. That stillness is not emptiness, it is fullness without noise. In this state, the mind stops rehearsing problems and stops imagining obstacles. Not because of discipline, but because there is no longer a psychological need to do so. The inner argument has ended, the imagination has finished its act, and like a seed planted in fertile soil, it no longer requires interference. The Sabbath is the silence that follows conviction, the calm that comes when the question has been answered so completely that it no longer arises. From this rest, life begins to move differently. Events do not feel chased or manufactured, they unfold. The individual does not feel withdrawn from life, but strangely aligned with it, as though carried rather than pushed. This is the quiet power of the Sabbath. Nothing is being forced, yet everything is being set in motion. The outer world has no choice but to respond, because consciousness has already decided, and having decided, it rests. There is a quiet paradox at the heart of manifestation that most people overlook. The harder you try to force a state into being, the more firmly it resists you. This is not because desire is wrong, but because effort often arises from the feeling that something is missing. Whenever the mind strains, it reveals an inner conflict between what is wanted and what is felt to be true. Neville described this as the law of reverse effort, the principle that explains why forcing a result so often produces the opposite of what is intended. The tension itself becomes the signal, and life responds faithfully to that tension rather than to the words or techniques being used. Prayer, in its truest sense, is not an act of persuasion or struggle. It is an act of yielding. The moment you attempt to compel reality to change, you place yourself in opposition to it, and opposition always strengthens the awareness of separation. When the feeling within is anxiety, urgency, or doubt, that feeling overrides the wish, no matter how noble or sincere the intention may be. Feeling is the deciding factor, because feeling reveals what the mind has already accepted as true. The inner atmosphere always wins, quietly but absolutely. This is why Neville emphasized states of drowsiness, relaxation, and what he called attention minus effort. In such moments, the sharp edge of conscious control softens and the mind becomes receptive rather than defensive. There is no strain in these states, no mental wrestling. The idea is allowed to enter rather than forced to comply. Just as the body cannot be commanded into sleep through effort, consciousness cannot be commanded into belief through pressure. Both respond only to permission. When effort drops away, something subtle but profound occurs. The wish is no longer held at arm's length by analysis or guarded by doubt. It is absorbed. The mind, no longer resisting itself, allows the assumption to take root without argument. This is not passivity. It is alignment. The will is not abandoned, but refined, redirected from force to acceptance. And in that acceptance, the very thing that effort was trying to achieve begins to happen naturally. The law of reverse effort reveals that flow is not created by doing more, but by interfering less. The mind learns that its role is not to coerce reality, but to consent to a state. Once that consent is given, struggle becomes unnecessary, and trying becomes impossible. The state moves in on its own momentum, carrying the individual with it, and what once felt difficult begins to feel inevitable. At the center of every manifestation lies a subtle but decisive shift in perspective, one that determines whether desire remains distant or becomes immediate. Thinking of the end places the wish somewhere ahead in time, as an object to be reached, earned, or attained. It keeps the desire safely outside the self, observed from the standpoint of current limitation. In this position, the mind may imagine vividly, affirm faithfully, and hope sincerely, yet it still looks toward fulfillment as something separate, something not yet possessed. The distance is psychological, but its effects are very real. Thinking from the end, by contrast, dissolves that distance entirely. It is not an act of visualization alone, but a relocation of identity. Neville referred to this as the activity of the second man, imagination functioning not as a spectator, but as the self. To think from the end is to view the world through the lens of the fulfilled state, to interpret circumstances from the standpoint of already being rather than becoming. In this shift, the wish is no longer something you are thinking about. It is the position from which you are thinking. When you think of a desire, you maintain a subject-object relationship. You are here, and the thing you want is there. This separation keeps the state alive as longing. But when you think from the desire, the subject and object merge. There is no longer an observer reaching toward a goal, there is only the state observing the world. This unification is the secret. The mind stops asking how or when, because those questions belong to the one who does not yet have. The one who has simply lives, perceives, and reacts from within that possession. This is why thinking from the end feels quieter than thinking of the end. There is less excitement, less mental noise, and far less urgency. The fulfilled state does not shout or demand attention. It assumes. It moves through the world with a natural authority that does not need to convince itself. When imagination occupies the end, reality begins to reorganize itself around that position, because consciousness has already chosen where it stands. To let the 3D world chase you, this shift is essential. The outer world cannot follow a desire that is being observed from afar. It can only mirror a state that is being lived. When you think from the end, you are no longer waiting for life to catch up to your imagination. Your imagination has already arrived, and life, obedient and impartial, must now follow. There is a quiet indicator that reveals whether an assumption is truly alive within you, and that indicator is naturalness. Neville taught that the time it takes for an assumption to harden into fact is directly proportionate to how natural it feels to you. This is not a judgment or a moral measure. It is simply the mechanics of consciousness. What feels foreign, strained, or artificial cannot remain stable in the mind, no matter how often it is repeated. The mind may visit it, rehearse it, and even admire it, but it will not dwell there. Only what feels natural can be lived in consistently. Many people misunderstand this principle and believe that intensity produces results. They attempt to overwhelm doubt with force, repetition, or emotional strain, not realizing that strain itself is evidence of unfamiliarity. A state that is truly accepted does not require constant reinforcement. It feels ordinary, almost unremarkable. When an assumption has taken root, it carries the same quiet certainty as your own name or your sense of being yourself. You do not wake up each day trying to convince yourself of who you are. You simply are. Manifestation operates by the same law. This is why results often appear when worry fades. Worry is the signal that the state has not yet become natural, that the mind is still oscillating between acceptance and rejection. But when concern drops away, not through suppression, but through familiarity, the state stabilizes. The imaginal act no longer feels like an exercise. It feels like a memory, a fact, something already integrated. At that point, imagination ceases to feel creative and begins to feel recollective, as though you are remembering rather than inventing. Naturalness does not mean excitement or emotional highs. In fact, excessive excitement often indicates that the mind still perceives the desire as extraordinary or unlikely. The fulfilled state carries a quieter tone. It feels reasonable. It feels appropriate. It feels like something that makes sense for you. When imagination reaches this quality, resistance dissolves without effort, because there is nothing left to resist. The state fits. An assumption hardens into fact when it no longer feels assumed, when it feels like the way things are. This is the vitality Neville spoke of, the living quality that allows a state to express itself through events without strain or delay. Once naturalness is achieved, manifestation is no longer a question of if or when. It is simply a matter of unfolding. One of the most subtle forms of resistance appears not as doubt about the end, but as fascination with the means. The mind may accept the desire as possible, even probable, yet remain restless over the question of how it will unfold. This curiosity often disguises itself as responsibility or intelligence, but in truth, it is another way of holding the seed before it has time to mature. To be indifferent to the how is not to be careless. It is to recognize that the conscious mind is not the architect of fulfillment, but the selector of states. Neville spoke of a dimensionally larger self, a level of awareness that holds knowledge and pathways far beyond the reach of analytical thought. When you assume the end, you activate this greater intelligence automatically. It does not consult your fears or limitations. It operates from the completed state and arranges the bridge of incidents accordingly. Concern over the means interrupts this process, not because it is morally wrong, but because it pulls attention back into the realm of effort and control. The mind attempts to manage what it was never meant to manage. When the end is truly assumed, the details lose their urgency. The question of how fades, not because it has been answered, but because it no longer matters. The fulfilled state does not anxiously calculate its own arrival. It rests in the certainty of being. This indifference creates space for movement. Without mental interference, events align in ways that often appear unexpected, even illogical, yet perfectly suited to the assumption that set them in motion. This is why trying to figure out the path often delays the journey. The conscious mind works with fragments, with past experience and visible conditions, while the greater self orchestrates from a perspective where the end is already secured. To trust this process is not blind faith. It is a recognition of hierarchy. You assume the destination, and the intelligence that knows the terrain takes over. The moment you stop gripping the seed, growth begins. Flow emerges naturally when concern over the how dissolves. There is a sense of being carried rather than pushed, guided rather than strained. Life starts to feel responsive instead of resistant. And in that responsiveness, the outer world begins to reflect the inner decision that has already been made. There is a power in stillness that is often overlooked because it appears passive. Yet stillness is not inaction. It is the quiet confidence that the desired state is already accomplished and that no further effort is required. Neville spoke of this principle in the language of Scripture. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. The teaching is not about waiting idly, but about anchoring consciousness so fully in the assumption of fulfillment that appearances cannot disturb it. The inner mind becomes immovable, a place of certainty untouched by the turbulence of the outer world. When the psychological state of the wish fulfilled has been captured, every subsequent action becomes secondary. The inner life carries its own momentum, and external circumstances bend to meet it without force. To remain unmoved by appearances is to place trust not in events, but in the law itself, which faithfully expresses whatever consciousness holds as true. The battle is not yours to fight, because it has already been settled in the invisible. The outer world merely reflects what has been established within. Standing still does not mean detachment from life. It means detachment from anxiety about life. When you are anchored in the assumed state, there is no struggle to rearrange reality, no need to coerce or manipulate. The power of stillness lies in its refusal to participate in doubt or lack. It is a deliberate placement of attention, an unwavering occupation of the fulfilled state. In this placement, the mind no longer oscillates between wanting and having, and the body ceases its futile efforts to compel a result that is already inevitable. This is the seventh blast of the trumpet, the final act of completion. The state itself carries the plan and the energy of its own expression. You are not the producer or the mover. You are the observer and the assumed identity. Remaining in this stillness allows the unseen to operate fully. The world may appear active, chaotic, or uncertain, but the inner mind knows that the end is secured. And when this knowing becomes permanent, the outer world becomes merely the echo of a completed inner act, following rather than leading, chasing rather than resisting. Renunciation is not about denying life or suppressing desire. It is the conscious withdrawal of attention from that which is unwanted, and the deliberate investment of attention into the state that has already been assumed. Neville often emphasized that resisting a problem only reinforces its presence. To fight against the outer world is to feed it with consciousness, giving it energy and solidity that it would not otherwise have. True renunciation, by contrast, is a redirection of awareness toward the desired outcome, a psychological death to the old state and a birth into the new. When one renounces, the grip on struggle loosens, and the mind ceases to wrestle with the visible world. The energy once expended in opposition becomes available for imagination, for the cultivation of the fulfilled state. The act of renunciation carries a quiet authority because it is not a forced act. It arises naturally when the individual identifies with what they wish to be rather than with what they appear to be. Attention, once diverted from the problem, begins to align with solution, and the mind inhabits a dimension where the desired state is already realized. Renunciation requires clarity and decisiveness. One cannot serve two masters. To cling simultaneously to the problem and the solution is to split consciousness and create internal conflict. The old state must be laid aside fully. Its hold is only broken by complete withdrawal of mental energy. Yet this withdrawal is not loss. It is the opening of space for the desired state to flourish without interference. The mind that renounces in this manner experiences freedom, relief, and the quiet certainty of inevitability. The practice of renunciation is subtle but transformative. It moves consciousness from reaction to creation, from engagement with resistance to alignment with possibility. By identifying solely with the fulfilled state, the individual not only releases tension, but invites reality to mirror the inner certainty. Life ceases to be a battle to overcome obstacles and becomes a reflection of what has already been assumed, unfolding naturally and without effort. In this release, the act of receiving becomes effortless, because the mind no longer obstructs the manifestation with divided attention or attachment to the problem. There is a profound power in assuming the reality of what cannot yet be observed. Neville described this as confidence in the unseen, a conviction that transcends hope, effort, or evidence. Faith in this sense is not passive wishing. It is the deliberate appropriation of an objective hope, making it subjectively real. The mind that inhabits this state no longer hesitates or vacillates between possibility and doubt. It is anchored in a reality that exists beyond the senses, yet is more tangible than any outer circumstance, because it defines the consciousness from which the outer must emerge. To possess confidence in the unseen is to navigate life from a foundation far deeper than the visible world. Shallow observation of circumstances or reliance on proof of the senses is no longer necessary. The individual begins to walk as though the wish fulfilled is already present, responding to inner reality rather than outer conditions. This confidence is steady, unshakable, and quiet. It does not shout for attention or reassurance, yet it exerts a magnetic influence, aligning events, people, and circumstances with the inner assumption. Neville emphasized that this state is cultivated through control of attention. The moment the mind ceases to be distracted by appearances and directs itself consistently toward the assumed reality, faith solidifies. It is not learned from reading or instruction. It is experienced as a natural consequence of living within the state of the wish fulfilled. The awareness that all attention is under one's command transforms the relationship with reality. One moves from shallow observation into the deep, where creation is perceived as already complete, and manifestation is inevitable. This confidence in the unseen establishes a psychological authority that the outer world cannot resist. Doubt no longer dictates the terms of experience. The individual moves in alignment with inner certainty, and life mirrors that certainty with effortless precision. The unseen becomes the operative reality, and what is visible follows naturally. It is here in this depth of awareness that flow is perfected, and the 3D world finally responds to the consciousness that no longer wavers. The secret of effortless receiving lies in the understanding that creation is already complete. There is nothing to manufacture, no events to force into existence, and no new substance to be drawn from nowhere. All that exists, all that will ever exist, already exists in the unseen realm. The role of consciousness is not to create in the sense of generating something new, but to become aware of and align with that which already is. Manifestation is therefore not a laborious process, but a discovery, a conscious selection from an infinite reality. When one truly grasps that creation is finished, the compulsion to strive, to push, or to chase diminishes naturally. The seeker recognizes that the world is abundant, not because it is generous, but because it is already complete. Every desire, every state, every outcome is present in its entirety, awaiting only the focused attention of the individual to reveal itself externally. The mind no longer experiences the illusion of lack, for it understands that nothing essential is missing. The task is no longer one of doing, but of being. This understanding also shifts identity from that of laborer to selector. The conscious self becomes a participant in a greater unfolding, responding to impulses and alignments that arise naturally from the assumed state. Every interaction, every event, every encounter becomes a reflection of the inner choice, rather than a test or obstacle to overcome. Life moves in accordance with consciousness because consciousness has already chosen its end. The perception of effort, struggle, or scarcity is seen for what it truly is, a resistance to the natural order that has already been established. By living with the knowledge that creation is finished, one enters a state of profound ease. There is no longer the tension of trying to produce outcomes or to orchestrate circumstances. The mind rests in certainty, the heart rests in faith, and the imagination flows freely from the fullness that already exists. Manifestation becomes not a task, but a reflection of inner alignment. What is assumed as real already exists, and the outer world follows silently, naturally, and inevitably. There is a subtle, almost magical force in the act of genuine thankfulness, a vibration that signals the mind has accepted the reality of the wish fulfilled. Neville taught that gratitude is not merely a polite acknowledgement or a reflection of what is already visible, but a recognition of the completed transaction in the unseen. When one assumes the feeling of having already received and responds with thankfulness, the consciousness moves from wanting to having, from seeking to embodying. The repetition of sincere acknowledgement, thank you, thank you, thank you, does not create the result. It confirms it, harmonizing the inner mind with the state it has already assumed. This feeling of thankfulness is more than an emotion. It is a bridge between the inner reality and the external world. It carries a quiet authority that the outer world cannot resist. When the mind dwells in the mood of gratitude, the individual ceases to be a supplicant and becomes a living demonstration of the fulfilled state. The heart aligns with the assumption, the mind stabilizes in conviction, and the imagination flows without interruption. Life begins to appear as if it is responding to the inner acknowledgement rather than to effort or planning. Thankfulness also carries within it the essence of completion. It removes any lingering sense of lack or delay, because it is impossible to be grateful for something that has not already been received in consciousness. This quality of awareness signals to the mind that the assumption is settled, that no further struggle is required, and that the 3D world is now free to reflect what has been firmly planted in the imagination. The outer world follows the inner certainty, but it only mirrors what is acknowledged, embraced, and internally celebrated. To dwell in thankfulness is to dwell in flow. It is the state in which receiving becomes effortless, natural, and inevitable. The individual no longer chases outcomes. The world aligns itself with the inner consciousness. Gratitude transforms the mind from a seeker into a receiver, from a participant in struggle into a witness of fulfillment. It is the quiet yet unstoppable power that completes the journey from trying to receiving, from effort to ease, and from desire to realization. Now, having traveled through the principles of flow, of stopping effort and allowing life to respond, there comes a moment of quiet integration. The mind, having considered the Sabbath, the law of reverse effort, thinking from the end, naturalness, indifference to the how, standing still, renunciation, confidence in the unseen, the finished nature of creation, and the creative power of thankfulness, begins to settle into a single rhythm. This rhythm is not taught or commanded. It is felt. It is the awareness that the wish fulfilled is not a distant goal, but the state from which all perception now flows. In this moment, the outer world may continue its appearance of activity and uncertainty, yet internally there is a deep conviction that nothing needs to be forced. Every detail, every circumstance, every event will align naturally with what has already been assumed. The mind no longer observes life from the position of lack or waiting. It observes life from the completeness that has already been embraced. The 3D world, previously a field of struggle, now responds obediently, reflecting the quiet certainty and inner alignment that have been cultivated. This integration is felt as stillness without emptiness, as movement without effort, as reception without anxiety. It is the culmination of understanding that all power lies in the state you occupy, not in the actions you perform. Flow is no longer a concept or technique. It is lived. The outer world moves in harmony with the inner state, and the individual experiences life as effortless, abundant, and continuous manifestation of the assumed reality. To rest here is to rest in life itself, in the knowledge that the desired state has already been achieved and that no struggle is necessary. The inner mind is anchored, the imagination flows naturally, and the heart acknowledges completion with quiet gratitude. The journey from trying to receiving, from effort to ease, from wanting to having, is no longer a pursuit but a settled reality. And in this reality all things follow, all things respond, and the 3D world finally chases the consciousness that has already arrived.